The wind is screaming through the cracks in the kitchen wall. It's January 1933. A father in eastern Kentucky stares at the empty gas can next to his Model A. No money, no fuel. No way to get to the mill 12 miles down the road, where a sack of cornmeal is waiting that his children need before Sunday. But that truck starts the next morning. And it runs. And it keeps running. All the way through the worst winter that Holler had ever seen, on a fuel he made himself, in a metal drum behind the smokehouse, for nothing. What that man knew, what almost every farmer in Appalachia knew between 1929 and 1942, is something you have never read in a single owner's manual printed in the last 60 years. There's a reason for that, and by the end of this, I'm going to hand you the same simple setup, the U.S. Army field tested in a 1939 report I'll name in a minute, the one that proved an ordinary gasoline engine will run, without modification, on a fuel you can produce from yard scraps in a 5-gallon bucket on your back porch this weekend. I should tell you something first. My grandfather, on my mother's side, kept an old galvanized drum behind his tool shed in southern Indiana, until the day he died in 1986. I asked him once what was in it. He just smiled and said, "That's what got us through when the gas station closed." I was 11. I didn't ask again. I spent the next 40 years filling up at the pump like everybody else, paying whatever they told me to pay, and it wasn't until I started digging through old Department of Agriculture bulletins 2 winters ago that I finally understood what that old man had been sitting on. The fuel is called producer gas. Some folks called it wood gas. The Swedes called it gengas. And in 1933, in the hollers and on the back roads of this country, it was the difference between a family that could still move and a family that was stuck. Here is how it worked for that Kentucky father. He took an empty steel drum, the kind that used to hold kerosene, and he cut a small door near the bottom and a pipe coming out the top. Inside, he packed dry hardwood, broken into chunks about the size of a chicken egg, not sawdust, not green wood, dry oak, hickory, or beech, split small. He lit a small fire at the bottom through that little door, and he closed it down so the wood couldn't burn freely. It smoldered instead. Starved of oxygen, the wood didn't turn to ash. It turned to gas. That gas, mostly carbon monoxide and hydrogen, traveled up through a simple cooler he made from a length of stovepipe coiled inside a bucket of creek water, then through a filter packed with corncobs and a layer of wool, and finally into the intake of his Model A, right where the carburetor breathed. He turned the crank. The engine coughed, it caught, and it ran. Now here's where it gets interesting. This wasn't some backwoods experiment. The U.S. Department of Agriculture published a bulletin in the 1930s on farm uses of producer gas, and the Forest Products Laboratory in Madison, Wisconsin, had been studying wood gasification since the 1920s. The numbers were not small. 1 pound of dry hardwood produced enough gas to do roughly the same work as 1/10 of a gallon of gasoline. 20 pounds of scrap wood, the kind you'd rake up after a windstorm, would take a light truck about 25 miles down a dirt road. Not fast. About 35 miles an hour at the top end, but moving. And the cost was zero, because the wood was already on the property. By 1942, when gasoline was rationed for the war, this same technology was running over 1 million vehicles across Europe. Sweden alone had more than 70,000 wood gas vehicles on the road by 1945. Trucks, tractors, buses, even fishing boats. The Swedish government published a technical manual on it that's still referenced today. Germany ran farm equipment on it. France ran taxis on it. And in rural America, quietly, without fanfare, families like that one in Kentucky had been doing it for a decade already. So you have to ask, if this worked, if it ran 1 million vehicles, if the Department of Agriculture printed bulletins on it and the Forest Products Lab proved out the numbers, why did your grandfather have a drum behind his shed and you have never heard of this in your life? That's where the story turns dark. Because somebody made money when this knowledge disappeared. A lot of money. And it didn't disappear by accident. In the years right after the war, when gasoline became cheap again and the highways got built and every small town got a service station on the corner, the oil companies had a problem. They had enormous refining capacity built up for the war effort, and they needed a domestic market big enough to absorb it. A farmer running his pickup on yard scraps was a farmer who wasn't buying gasoline. A whole generation of country folks who knew how to make their own fuel was a generation that couldn't be sold to. So the knowledge got pushed aside. It didn't get banned. It just stopped getting taught. The agricultural extension offices stopped printing the bulletins. The shop class textbooks dropped the chapter. The new tractors came out with sealed engines and warnings on the manuals that said use only refined gasoline or void the warranty. And within 20 years, a thing that every farmer's son in 1935 could have built in an afternoon was a thing nobody under 50 had ever heard of. The American Petroleum Institute, founded in 1919, became the most powerful trade lobby in Washington in the post-war period. They didn't have to outlaw wood gas. They just had to make sure nobody remembered it existed. And they succeeded so completely that today, if you tell most people you can run a gasoline engine on smoldering oak chips, they'll look at you like you've lost your mind. But it works. It worked then. It works now. The chemistry hasn't changed. The engines haven't changed in any way that matters. A modern small engine, the kind in a generator, a rototiller, a lawnmower, a wood chipper, a water pump, a 1990s pickup truck with a carburetor, it will all run on producer gas with no modification to the engine itself. The only thing you build is the gasifier, the cooler, and the filter. That's it. Now I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, that's fine for a man with 40 acres and a barn, but I live in a house in town. I've got a quarter-acre lot and a neighbor on each side. This isn't for me. I want to talk to you for a minute, because you're wrong about that, and I want to show you why. You don't need a farm, you don't even need a yard. What you need is a generator. Any small gasoline generator, the kind people buy for storms, the kind that sits in the garage half the year doing nothing, is the perfect engine to start with. They're simple, they're carbureted, they have one job, and they will run on producer gas just as happily as the Model A did in 1933. The gasifier itself can be built from a 20-pound propane tank with the valve removed, or a steel paint can, or a small steel drum, whatever you have. You cut an intake hole near the bottom, a gas outlet at the top, and you pack it with dry hardwood chunks. You connect the gas outlet through a length of copper or steel pipe to a simple cooler, which is just that same pipe coiled inside a bucket of cold water, and from there into a filter, which is a second can packed with wood chips or even crumpled newspaper, and from the filter, a rubber hose runs to the air intake of your generator. You light the wood at the bottom through the intake hole, you let it smolder for 2 or 3 minutes until you see clear gas coming out the top, and you pull the starter cord. It will cough, it will sputter, and then it will catch, and it will run, and it will make electricity, and it will not cost you a dime in fuel. This is something you can build in a weekend with a drill, a hacksaw, and parts from the hardware store, on a back patio, in a garage, behind a townhouse, anywhere you can safely have a small contained fire. You don't need permits. You don't need contractors. You don't need land. You need maybe $40 in fittings if you have to buy them new, and most of it you probably already have lying around. And here is the part I have been holding back. The part the research turned up that almost no one talks about, even in the small online communities that still play with this stuff. The detail that turns this from a curiosity into the thing your grandparents actually knew. The U.S. Army produced a technical manual in 1939, and a later wartime report studied by the Federal Emergency Management Agency in 1989, when the government quietly asked the question, could the American people fuel themselves in a crisis if the pipelines went down? That FEMA report, titled Construction of a Simplified Wood Gas Generator for Fueling Internal Combustion Engines in a Petroleum Emergency, was authored by H. LaFontaine and F. Zimmerman and published through Oak Ridge National Laboratory. You can still find it. It's a real federal document, published with our tax dollars, that gives you the exact dimensions, the exact materials, and the exact procedure to build a working wood gas generator out of a stratified downdraft design, and it was written specifically for ordinary citizens with no engineering background. The government knew. They knew in 1989. They wrote it down, they published it, and they put it on a shelf, and they never told you about it, because telling you about it would have meant admitting that the entire fuel infrastructure of this country could be replaced, in a pinch, by a man with a steel drum and a pile of dry oak. But here is the surprising detail. The thing the old-timers knew that even the federal report only mentions in passing. It's the wood itself. The single biggest factor in whether your gasifier runs clean and your engine runs strong is not the design of the drum or the length of the cooler. It is the moisture content of the wood. The Forest Products Laboratory tested this back in the 30s, and the FEMA report confirmed it. Wood at less than 20% moisture produces clean, hot, hydrogen-rich gas that an engine will sip all day. Wood at 30% moisture produces wet, tarry gas that fouls the filter in 20 minutes and gums up the carburetor. That's why your grandfather kept his wood in the smokehouse. Not for the smoke, for the dry. A smokehouse, or any small enclosed space with a low constant heat, drops the moisture content of split hardwood to under 15% in about 3 weeks. That was the secret. That was the part that didn't get written down. The drum and the pipe and the filter, anybody could figure out. But the men who kept their wood properly seasoned, in the dry, warm dark behind the kitchen, those were the men whose trucks ran clean and whose engines lasted 20 years on producer gas. You can do the same thing in a modern home. A small wooden box in a heated garage, or a shelf above a wood stove, or even a closet near a furnace vent, will dry split hardwood to engine-grade moisture in 2 to 4 weeks. Split it to about the size of a chicken egg, like the man in Kentucky did. Stack it loose so air can move through it. And when you fire up your gasifier with that wood, the gas comes out hot and clean and your engine purrs. That is the piece your great-grandparents knew that the manual writers and the engineers and even most of the modern hobbyists miss. The fuel is not just wood. The fuel is dry wood, prepared with patience. The way a generation that had nothing but patience used to prepare everything they touched. So that's what you've got. A real federal document with your name on it, in the sense that it was paid for by your taxes and written for citizens like you. A technique field-tested by the U.S. Army, deployed across Europe in the millions, used quietly in rural America for 2 decades, an engine you already own sitting in your garage, a fuel growing in your yard or piled at the curb after every storm, and one small piece of grandfather knowledge, the moisture rule, that turns a curiosity into something that actually works the first time you try it. This isn't survival fantasy, this is what people did. This is what kept a father in eastern Kentucky moving in the worst winter of his life. This is what got cornmeal home to children who would otherwise have gone hungry. And it is sitting there, right now, waiting for you to pick it back up. You didn't lose this knowledge. It was taken from you, quietly, profitably, and on purpose. And tonight, you took it back. If you're the kind of person who remembers a grandfather with a drum behind the shed, or a grandmother who never threw anything away, or a father who could fix anything in the driveway with a wrench and a swear word, then this is your inheritance. This is who you are. This is what your people knew. I want to hear from you in the comments. Tell me about the wood your family burned. Was it oak, hickory, beech, pine? Tell me what part of the country you're from and what your grandfather used to keep behind his shed or in his barn that you never quite understood until now. I read every one of those, and so do the other folks gathering here, and that's how we put the pieces back together, one memory at a time. So leave the comment. Don't just think it. Type it. If you want to keep walking this road with us, recovering the things our grandparents knew and the corporations hoped we'd forget, you know where the subscribe button is. Hit it. Because the next thing I want to show you is the Depression-era food preservation method that kept meat edible for 18 months without a refrigerator, without canning, and without a single grain of salt, and the family that taught it to me swore the government tried to make them stop. I'll see you then.